Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
It is clear to me that the British Parliament, reflecting the views of the British people, does not want to see British military action. I get that, and the government will act accordingly.
That was David Cameron speaking in 2013 when Parliament voted against airstrikes on the Assad regime in Syria. That vote, one of several on the issue since, shows how much the conflict in Syria has weighed on British politics over the more than 10 years of civil war. Now the regime has been toppled, so what happens next? You're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Stephen Carroll.
And I'm Lizzy Burden. Welcome to the programme. Once again, events in the Middle East are shaping the news here in London. The Syrian President Bashar al-Assad fleeing the country as rebels advanced on Damascus. And he's now in Moscow, which creates a political vacuum in a country that's suffered, as you say, Stephen, more than a decade of devastating civil war. So it's yet another upheaval in a tumultuous year for the Middle East as a region. But what does it mean for the UK?
As it happens, Keir Starmer is actually in the Middle East on a trip that includes the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. The Prime Minister had initially planned to talk about trade on this trip, but inevitably the conversation will now have to take in what the change of regime in Syria means for its neighbours and for Europe.
Well, the immediate question in Westminster for the government is whether to lift the ban on the Islamist group which toppled Assad, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, known as HTS. It's banned in the UK because of its past association with al-Qaeda. The Cabinet Minister, Pat McFadden, has said the situation's very fluid, and he hopes if there is a need to hold talks with HTS, in his words, it should be a relatively swift decision.
Well, let's bring in Paul Wallace, who leads our team covering economics and government in the Middle East, for more. Paul, first of all, can you just bring us up to speed on what happened over the weekend? Who is running Syria now?
It was quite a stunning and rapid turn of events. We've gone from Syria being nowhere in the news, less than 2 weeks ago, to the Assad regime being toppled. We went into the weekend with essentially HTS forces outside the city of Homs, and that was the last city on their route to Damascus. And a lot of people thought, well, okay, even if it goes well for HTS, it's going to take a few days at best for them to reach Damascus. But what ended up happening was that the Syrian army basically dissolved without any fight whatsoever. Homs was taken with a few shots being fired, and the same was the same thing happened with Damascus, which was taken sometime on Saturday evening. So at the moment, this group HTS, which broke away from al-Qaeda in 2016, it's a Sunni Islamist organization. They control the capital right now, and the country is held by a large number of different opposition groups, but the one that holds most power right now is clearly HTS.
So given that this took Russia, Iran, the US, everybody by surprise, are there other countries that we should be watching more carefully now? What does it mean for the wider region in the Middle East?
So I think for the neighboring states, they're particularly wary. I mean, Assad had more or less lost his allies to a large extent. There was little love for him, and certainly there's little mourning for him now that he's toppled. But there is a fear about what comes next. For all that Assad was brutal and widely despised by his own people and many other beyond Syria, there was a semblance of stability in the country. Yes, Assad's government didn't control all parts of it, and the rebels, HTS, were able to advance from the northwest Idlib, which they still held, but it was, broadly speaking, stable, and the situation in the country wasn't really a threat to the rest of the region. Of course, Turkey was constantly worried about what Kurdish militias were doing and whether they would take over more territory near Turkey's border in the north of Syria. Now no one knows what will happen. There's a potential for a power vacuum and a very messy, unpeaceful transition to something else that could leave Syria in a state of chaos for months, if not years. That's kind of the worst case scenario. It doesn't necessarily have to be like that. It's possible that HTS consolidates its power and works with other groups to essentially ensure there's a proper functioning government in Syria pretty soon, but we just don't know. So the neighboring countries are definitely wary. Russia and Iran, I think they're pretty, in some ways, they're pretty humiliated and shocked. They've lost a key ally in Assad in the Middle East. Both of them were either unwilling or unable to prop him up at the end. They offered very little support, as it turned out. I think the Iranians tried a bit harder than the Russians, but ultimately, whether they just knew that Assad was going, or they just couldn't do anything themselves. There was nothing like what they did in 2015 when they essentially saved his regime and turned the Syrian civil war in his favor. And then you look at sort of Western and pro-Western powers like Israel and the US and the UK and other European nations. I think they're watching on very nervously as well. For Europe, there's the question of migration again. Obviously, there are huge numbers of Syrian migrants in Europe and also Turkey. Do we see more of them come out the country again and start heading towards Europe or trying to get to Europe? That's one issue. But I think generally there's a fear that Syria, which is a huge, very large landmass at a key strategic point in the Middle East, becomes chaotic.
Yeah, indeed. And the risk, as you laid out them there, for further instability and what that could mean not only for the immediate neighbours but for countries across Europe as well. Thinking about, we're focused on this decision that the government here is going to have to make about how they interact, how they deal with HTS as a group, given that they're currently on a prescribed list. What can you tell us about how that group has evolved? You mentioned they'd split away from al-Qaeda. Are they very different now from when the UK would have designated them a terrorist organisation?
That's essentially the argument that they're putting forward, that they've moderated hugely since the breakaway from al-Qaeda in 2016. And essentially, they're saying that was a reason for a big part of the reason for breaking away from al-Qaeda. But they're still designated a terrorist organization by the US and many other Western countries. And there's still a huge amount of uncertainty about the group and its leader, Ahmed al-Shara, who also goes by the nom de guerre of Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, and what they will do. Al-Jolani is certainly putting out a message that all Syrians, regardless of their ethnicity or religion, will be safe under areas ruled by HTS. He did an interview with CNN last Thursday, and he very much said that nobody had anything to fear from HTS rule. But at the end of the day, it is an organization with at least elements of extremists within it. And I think there'll be, as far as the West is concerned and sanctions, I think it'll be a case of watching and waiting to see what HTS does and how it acts on a huge host of issues, especially regarding women's rights and human rights more generally.
And of course, there was a lot of hope for Assad when he first came in, presented himself as a moderate, and look how that turned out. But the thing you were meant to be covering today, Paul, was Keir Starmer meeting the president of the UAE and the Saudi Crown Prince bin Salman today. How does that tie into the situation in Syria? What's their position on the events there?
Well, it's a good question. The UAE has been a bit more involved in Syria in recent years than Saudi Arabia. Essentially, both of them have acted to almost bring Assad back into the fold when it comes to organizations like the Arab League, and he traveled to the UAE and Saudi Arabia in the past 2 years. And they did make, especially on the UAE side, a sort of a push of some sorts with the West to see if they would ease sanctions on Syria. And essentially their argument was, look, sanctions haven't worked. Assad is still in power. He's not going anywhere. So rather than just continuing to isolate the country, which is doing no one any good, let's try and turn over the page and start fresh. That obviously didn't happen. And to be honest, I don't think even they thought there was much of a chance of the West doing anything to ease sanctions on Assad, given the brutality of his government. And I think a lot of Europeans will now be saying, well, we kind of, your argument that Assad was safe and was here to stay was ultimately proven very incorrect. When this rebellion by HTS started, or if you call it a rebellion, let's say an advance by HTS started only about 10 days ago, the Syrian army proved to be extremely hollowed out and offered almost no resistance whatsoever. And a lot of people are saying, look, the only reason he survived this long was because of Russia and Iran. It wasn't because of any support he had within the country or the strength of Syria's institutions. So I think there will be almost a sense that, within the West, they did the right thing, that Assad needed to be isolated, and maybe there's some regret among European states and others that they couldn't do something to topple him sooner. What the UAE and the Saudi Arabia do now will be very interesting. I think they're at a loss in the immediate term. I think they're, like other countries, are going to be watching and waiting to see what unfolds in the immediate term before they know what they can do and who they can deal with.
Yeah, indeed. It's going to be very interesting to see what commentary comes out of those meetings as well that Keir Starmer has while he's on that trip to the Middle East. Paul Wallace in Dubai, thank you very much for joining us with that as well. And Lizzy, look, I mean, you have to remember as well is that Keir Starmer went out on this trip also hoping to talk about the war in Gaza and to try and see what sort of, progress can be found on finding a resolution in that conflict. This is yet another change in the balance of power in the region as well. So that's going to make those conversations much more difficult. And we know that's an issue that's had an impact on politics here in the UK as well. I mean, if you look at many of the election results, for example, and the Labour MPs who split away from the party because of their position over the conflicts in the Middle East. So, I mean, this is an issue that is important for Keir Starmer and for the UK on an international front. But there are domestic political ramifications too. But
it's partly the fact that countries like Iran, like Russia, are distracted with the wars in Gaza and Ukraine that this situation has happened. And I'm sure that there are lots of governments around the world drawing the conclusion from Syria that they needed to have more military bandwidth. And do we actually start seeing the pendulum swinging back towards having that appetite for military intervention? We started the show with the David Cameron clip. Do we come back to the situation where we were perhaps a decade ago? We'll continue to monitor developments. Well, that's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe, give it 5 stars so other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen. This episode was produced by James Woolcock and our audio engineer was Sean Guastamakia. I'm Lizzy Burden. And I'm Stephen Carroll. We'll be back with more tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.